Today, presidents stood before dozens of world leaders and issued a countdown, 10 days. That was all he gave the Islamic Republic of Iran to come to the negotiating table. We're either going to get a deal, he said, or it's going to be unfortunate for them. Unfortunate. That word landed like a grenade, because at that exact moment, 500 miles south of Iran's coastline, in the warm blue waters of the Arabian Sea, a 1,092-foot nuclear-powered warship named after the man who preserved the American Union was already in position, loaded, watching, waiting. This is the story of the most dangerous 10-day countdown the world has seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what happens if the clock runs out. But before we get to what happens if Tehran blinks, or doesn't, you need to understand exactly what is floating in those waters. Because most people see aircraft carrier and think of a big ship. What they don't understand is the true scale of what America has positioned off Iran's coast. And once you grasp the numbers, everything else makes sense. Run the numbers with me. The USS Abraham Lincoln, CVN-72, is not just an aircraft carrier. It is a $6.8 billion floating Air Force base. It displaces 104,000 tons of steel when fully loaded. That is heavier than the Eiffel Tower, 4 times over. It carries 5,700 sailors and aviators. It hosts up to 90 aircraft, including F/A-18 Super Hornets, F-35C Lightning IIs, EA-18G Growlers capable of jamming every radar Iran owns, and E-2 Hawkeye surveillance planes that can see everything within 300 miles. It is not alone. Escorting it are 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, USS Spruance, USS Michael Murphy, and USS Frank E. Peterson, Jr. Each destroyer carries 96 vertical launch cells capable of firing Tomahawk cruise missiles that can reach Tehran. Each Tomahawk costs $2 million. There are thousands of them in the region right now. But here's what nobody tells you. The Abraham Lincoln is not the only carrier. A second flat-top, USS Gerald R. Ford, was steaming toward the Middle East as Trump delivered his ultimatum. When both strike groups are fully in position, the United States will have deployed the largest concentration of American naval firepower in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. 2 carriers, 14 warships, over 170 cargo aircraft tracked heading into the region, more than 85 aerial refueling tankers, dozens of F-35s, F-22s, F-15s, and F-16s repositioned to bases in Jordan and the wider region. One Pentagon official put it plainly: the buildup will be fully in place by mid-March, and the clock is already ticking. To understand why this moment is so explosive, you have to understand what happened last June. On June 21, 2025, U.S. and Israeli forces launched coordinated strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities in what became known as Operation Midnight Hammer. Natanz, Fordo, Isfahan, 3 of the crown jewels of Iran's nuclear program, were hit. Trump declared at the time that they had been obliterated. Iran responded with missile barrages that strained Israeli air defenses to their limits. 12 days of open warfare between the world's most sanctioned nation and the most powerful military alliance on Earth. Then a ceasefire brokered under enormous pressure from Gulf Arab states, terrified of what came next. But here is the part that kept American intelligence analysts awake at night. The damage was real, but was it decisive? Satellite imagery from January 2026 showed a new roof being constructed over the pilot fuel enrichment plant at Natanz. Iran was rebuilding, and it had barred UN nuclear inspectors from verifying what was left. Nobody outside Tehran knew exactly how close Iran's program had come back, and that uncertainty, that fog, is what brought 2 aircraft carriers to the Arabian Sea. This wasn't a show of force. This was a demand receipt. Trump's ultimatum was specific. Iran had to agree to a meaningful deal: zero uranium enrichment, the dismantling of facilities at Natanz, Fordo, and Isfahan, an end to its ballistic missile program, and a severing of financial and military support for proxy groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Those were the American red lines. They were not up for debate, but Tehran had its own position, and it was just as firm. Iran's UN ambassador, Amir Saeed Iravani, sent a letter directly to the UN Security Council on February 19th. The message was unambiguous: Iran does not seek war and will not start one. But if the United States attacks, every American base, facility, and asset in the region becomes a legitimate target. That phrase, legitimate target, covered hundreds of thousands of American troops stationed across Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Jordan, and beyond. Iran's foreign minister insisted the talks should focus only on the nuclear file, nothing more. No discussion of missiles, no discussion of proxies, just the bomb. The Americans rejected that framing entirely. You do not get to rebuild your nuclear program, arm Hezbollah with 150,000 rockets pointed at Israel, and then tell the superpower parked off your coast that missiles are off the table. That is not a negotiation. That is a delay tactic dressed in diplomatic language. That is the trap, and both sides know it. Here is where the math gets terrifying. Iran has approximately 3,000 ballistic missiles. It has developed hypersonic glide vehicles. It has a fleet of kamikaze Shahed drones that cost as little as $20,000 each. An SM-6 interceptor missile fired from an American destroyer to shoot one down costs $4.3 million. That is a 215-to-1 cost ratio in Iran's favor on every drone it launches. Iran has studied this math. The IRGC has war-gamed exactly this scenario, a massive drone and missile swarm designed to overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume, not sophistication. They believe numbers are their equalizer. But here's what the Iranians didn't fully account for. On February 3rd, 3 weeks before Trump's ultimatum, an Iranian Shahed 139 drone maneuvered toward the Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea. An F-35C Lightning II, one of the most advanced stealth fighters ever built, intercepted and destroyed it. The entire engagement lasted minutes. The crew of the Lincoln barely flinched. That engagement was a message. Washington heard it. Tehran heard it too. The diplomatic channel was not dead, not yet. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and senior negotiator Jared Kushner had met with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Geneva just 2 days before Trump's ultimatum. Araghchi told reporters the two sides had reached broad agreement on a set of guiding principles. The White House was more measured. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said the sides remained apart on some issues. That is diplomatic code for "we are nowhere near a deal," and the Iranians knew it. What Tehran was attempting was a strategy as old as the regime itself: stalling. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei had already publicly rejected the terms. He had told supporters not to protest the talks, describing them as a temporary delay. His words, translated directly, "The talks are just a delay until the Islamic Shiite state is established." Analysts at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies described it plainly. Iran was trying to present a deal that would essentially freeze the current situation on paper and extract sanctions relief for something America had already achieved through force. The Trump administration called that a non-starter. The clock kept running. Now, look at what was moving on the chessboard beyond the two carriers. Poland had urged its citizens to evacuate Iran immediately. Prime Minister Donald Tusk warned his citizens they might have only hours. European governments were emptying their embassies. Israel was quietly repositioning air defense batteries. A U.S. Air Force command and control aircraft, the kind used to coordinate special forces operations, landed at Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv. That aircraft does not show up unless a mission is being planned. And the Abraham Lincoln? Captain Daniel Keeler and his 5,700 sailors were conducting routine flight operations. The official CENTCOM statement was surgically neutral. Abraham Lincoln is deployed to support security and stability within the Middle East region. That sentence, that bland sentence, concealed the most consequential naval deployment in 20 years. Here is what those flight operations actually look like at operational readiness. F/A-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 151 launching from the flight deck into the Arabian Sea air. F-35C Lightning IIs from Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 314 entering the same airspace. EA-18G Growlers, electronic warfare aircraft that can blind, deceive, and destroy Iranian radar installations from beyond visual range, cycling through their own sorties. Every flight was practice. Every flight was also a targeting run being refined. But here's the question that nobody in Washington had fully answered. What happens the morning after? Strike Iran's air defenses, its nuclear sites, its missile depots, and then what? The IRGC doesn't surrender. The regime doesn't collapse in 48 hours. Iran retaliates through proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile-wide choke point through which 1/5 of the world's oil passes every single day, becomes a war zone, 21 miles. For reference, that is roughly the distance from New York City to Newark, New Jersey. That narrow strip of water handles approximately 17 million barrels of oil per day. Japan gets 90% of its oil through it. South Korea gets 70%. India and China are similarly dependent. The moment the first American missile hits an Iranian coastal battery, the world's energy markets will crater into chaos. Oil hits $200 per barrel overnight. The global economy convulses. That is not a hypothetical. That is the planning scenario in every war game run by CENTCOM since 2019. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies ran this scenario in 2024 and concluded that even a limited strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure would likely trigger a 60-day regional escalation involving at least 4 proxy forces simultaneously. The Houthis in Yemen would immediately resume attacks on Red Sea shipping, choking the Suez Canal route. Hezbollah in Lebanon would bombard northern Israel with its estimated 150,000 rocket arsenal. Iranian-backed militias in Iraq would target the 2,500 American troops still stationed at Al-Assad Air Base. Every domino was preloaded. One senior official inside the administration told reporters privately that Trump's deadline might be less about forcing a deal and more about something else entirely. They're using the diplomatic process to buy time to make sure we have the appropriate military assets in the region, the official said. The deadline wasn't just pressure on Iran, it was a calendar for the Pentagon. And yet, not everyone inside the American national security architecture agreed on what came next. Retired Air Force Brigadier General John Teichert said the window for negotiations was closing and that Iran would face the full force of the U.S. military if it refused. Congressional Democrats invoked the War Powers Act, demanding Trump seek congressional approval before any strike. Representative Sarah Jacobs of California said plainly, "We should not be in the business of taking them out. That's not the solution." But history has a strange way of reducing those debates to footnotes. When the carrier is already 500 miles from the coast, the debate tends to be over. Here is what we know for certain as of February 23, 2026. Trump has set the most explicit deadline of his second term for Iran. The largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East in over 2 decades is in place, or nearly so. 2 carrier strike groups are positioned for simultaneous operations. Iran has refused to accept zero enrichment. Iran has refused to discuss its missile program. Iran has refused to cut ties with Hezbollah and Hamas. And Khamenei told his followers that any attack would meet a response that would reach every American asset in the region. That is not 2 sides approaching agreement. That is 2 locked positions with steel and jet fuel between them. And a president who has already pulled the trigger once, in June 2025, and is openly threatening to do so again. The next 10 days will answer a question that every major power on Earth is asking right now. Is this the ultimatum that ends with a deal, or is this the ultimatum that ends with the largest naval strike since the Gulf War? The USS Abraham Lincoln is already in position. Captain Keeler's pilots are already flying their sorties. The Tomahawks are already programmed. The only thing missing is the order. And somewhere in Tehran, in a fortified command bunker deep underground, the men who run the Islamic Republic are staring at the same clock we are, wondering if Donald Trump means what he says. Wondering if this time, unlike 2015, unlike 2018, unlike every other moment they waited him out, this time the math is different. It is different. 2 carriers make it different. The post-June 2025 wreckage of 3 nuclear facilities and Iran's desperate rebuilding effort that the world is watching via satellite make it different. 14 warships make it different, and a president who has demonstrated he will use force makes it different in a way that no previous ultimatum ever was. The question is whether Tehran understands that yet, and whether they can communicate it to a supreme leader who has spent 46 years telling his people that America will never actually pull the trigger. The clock is running, the Lincoln is watching, and somewhere beneath the flight deck, 5,700 sailors are waiting to find out which side of history they will be standing on when those 10 days expire. What happens next could reshape the Middle East for the next 50 years.